Hey all, welcome back. This week we'll be looking at democracy, electoral reform and the new media. We will explore the importance of social media as a potent medium of democratization and what are the government reactions in relation to the increasing amount of social media users today. Despite this increase, it is important to take note of the rural-urban divide and their significance in relation to the process of democratization.
And because social media is such a popular form of communication among the young, the campaign is also being fought on the internet. The ruling coalition has set up a cyber youth team, training more than 2,000 so-called cyber activists.
We were also tasked to counter false allegation, slanders by the opposition. And also we are asked to disseminate information to the people.
The opposition coalition, long denied fair access to newspapers and broadcast stations, has made the internet their home and made huge gains in the last election.
For this week, we have interviewed Dr. Meredith Wise and Mr. Nicky Cheong, both sharing very distinct perspectives in relation to democratization and media.
If we are studying students as a specific type of activist, we need to look at the setting in which they're embedded, which is the university campus itself. So in the early years of the universities, and initially there was just one in Singapore, University of Malaya developed a branch in KL, and then everything developed from there. A very tiny proportion of the population had a tertiary education. And so students, those who were undergraduates, were specifically being trained as future elites. Most women in schools and university at that time were being trained to be teachers. The civil service was not yet open in any substantial way to women. But other positions were as leaders of industry, leaders of the economy, leaders of government. So you had all sorts of political leaders, for instance, at the time, coming to campus to exhort students to be involved with society, not to be aloof, not to be separated by a class background or by the fact that they were at that time English educated, whereas very few others were, and to be engaged in trying to lead this new nation forward. That lasts for a couple decades after independence. But as higher education becomes more normalized, as it becomes more technically focused, in other words, more of an explicit focus on practical rather than more theoretical or knowledge for knowledge's sake type fields, we see a repositioning of the universities and thus of students as well. So you have both a structural repositioning of the university and a discursive, I argue in the book, a discursive repositioning of students as members of society. So with the University and University Colleges Act in the 1970s, students specifically are barred from being active in political parties, for instance, even though other youths their age could be. And so that's a reversal of the prior position. And so in that sense, students, I think, do lose a certain credibility or a certain, not necessarily in their own minds, but in terms of the stance they might make politically, they, instead of being exhorted to be involved, are enjoined against involvement. They're told that, they're too immature, that employers won't hire them if they're seen as troublemakers, that they shouldn't be getting involved in these sorts of things. So it's really a switch over time. So students then, especially by the late 1990s, and even before then, there had always been some students who still saw their role as partly political, just as a collective identity. But especially by the late 1990s, with the development of the Reformasi period, you see something of a rebirth of different types of student activism and an argument for students as having a specific role in society and in politics as citizens. Well, so part of the issue now is that the internet is not just available to students, it's available to everyone. So students who are engaged now in Malaysia are engaged less specifically as students than just as citizens. In other words, they may join human rights groups, they may join political parties, they may join alternative media, they may be bloggers, but that's not so much because they are students, which is the argument made previously. So in 1969, when the University of Malaya Student Union and the then the Socialist Club at University of Malaya had a students' manifesto for the 1969 elections and traveled the country promoting this manifesto, it was specifically as students. Now, when students take action, it's less through campus organizations, less a student council, and more often as part of a larger network. Part of that just has to do with the fact that we have both public and private universities, only since the mid-1990s. We have a lot more universities, and we have a greater range of students in terms of those who have different areas of focus, those who are on campus, different lengths of time, and so forth. For Malaysia specifically, freedom of expression is in a tenuous position right now. It's not so much the Peaceful Assembly Act, it's more this really, on the one hand, loose use of things like the Sedition Act, where even government ministers have said, well, we're not really sure what sedition is, but yet they still continue to use the act. So I find that this is a real challenge to freedom of expression and encourages self-censorship out of fear of this act. But the greater challenge, because it's not so easily remediable, is a polarization of discourse in Malaysia, which is echoed in a similar polarization in various other places. It may just be something of a global wave, I'm not sure. But the level of stereotyping, of all or nothing discussions, and the shutting down of critical engagement and dialogue in favor of sweeping pronouncements, I find to be problematic in terms of activism and engagement and discourse broadly. That said, in terms of activism widely, I don't think the amendment of one or another law is quite so consequential as just a more broad trend toward a diffusion of forms of activism, of the structures and the vehicles, the tactics used by activists. So we find everything from independent book publishing to the use of documentary film to the use of cartoons and all other literary forms, to large groups, small groups. You mentioned the internet, of course that's important, not just for information dissemination, but also for new ways of networking and new communities that can form on and offline. So on the one hand, we may have more activism that's not in person and that's less interactive, which can be a real problem in terms of building community, building collective action. But on the other hand, I think there's actually a real rejuvenation of a range of forms of activism, which is nice to see. And some of it's specifically communal, which is a long-standing tradition of Malaysia. A lot of it is not. So you have a mixture of identity-based as well as issues-based activism. No government likes demonstrations. It's just not something governments tend to like. I mean, there might be some, but just in popular engagement, yes. I mean, I think even the current government is more open to certain forms of, or some members of it, open to certain forms of engagement or involvement, discussion, inclusion, than past governments. And some of that has to do with just the unavoidability. So you have people like Khairy Jamaluddin, for instance, who holds these, meet-up sessions with youth, organizing people around Twitter and so forth. All the major political parties now have some sort of, internship programs or leadership training programs or whatever it may be. Both BN and opposition do this. And so I think actually there is a greater recognition, not in the same way as before, but a greater recognition of the need to be inclusive, that's part of what's demanded. It doesn't necessarily translate into concrete policy influence. So in other words, the fact that you're being consulted doesn't mean that you're being heeded, right? But it can have that influence. I think there is a recognition that there are certain skills needed for governing, and that's part of the reason for these leadership training institutes and so forth. Some of them include really open, active discussion of current issues and that sort of thing, which I think is good. This isn't the same as the early independent years of political leaders telling the tiny proportion of university students, you are the future leaders, you must take action. Because not every university student now, quite frankly, is a future leader. But I do think that there's a recognition of the need for space for voice, that it will be taken if it's not given. But that's a gradual process.
So new media, I think in the context that we understand it today, obviously it's internet-related forms of media, and this it doesn't have and how has it changed political communication? I guess it's allowed people to, number one, speak out much more. Previously, again because of the laws that I mentioned just now, not many people had a platform to make statements and say things and express how they feel. You know, you can write a letter to the editor of a newspaper, but there's no saying that it will be published. Whereas these days, anybody can be a publisher. So that's one way of that's changed it. Second is that I think politicians have realized that they need to kind of communicate with the public as well. So, you know, from our prime minister down to the opposition leader to anyone who's remotely involved in the political scene would have a social media presence for two reasons. One is to kind of, you know, say the things that they want to say, but number two as well, so that they can keep in touch with what people are saying, get a pulse of what society feels at that point. I think in that sense it's done a massive change, because before this we felt so, a lot of people I think felt so distant from politicians, whereas now they're just a tweet away, and a lot of them, if those who do it correctly actually responds properly, then you actually kind of, you know, at the end of the day, because if their roles is to serve the people, then at least the people feel like they're being served at the very least. I don't know whether it's used differently during election period as opposed to any other time. I think political communication, the way it's being used in discussing in political discourse, is quite consistent. Obviously during election period, tensions are high, so people, you know, and the issues are very specific, right? So whatever that candidate is standing for, there will be discussion on those things. Whatever the party, whichever party it is, whatever their manifesto is, it will be very heavily discussed. I think it's good that we have this platform now, because I think that as they're discussing their manifesto and some people can question them, either you're with the government or the opposition, I think it allows for a lot of interesting discourse, and I think it has, you know, a couple of times, whether or not it's admitted that it has kind of changed the course of certain decisions that are going to be made. You know, we like to laugh and call it backpedaling, but at the end of the day, you know, if you're implementing something that there's huge resistance from the public and you backpedal, I don't think that's a really bad thing, because at least you're listening to the public instead of imposing your policies. So it's allowed for that to happen a lot. I mean, talking about specifically during an election period, obviously each of the political parties have their campaigns and their strategy, and social media is a massive part of it. I think we can see that in the last 10 to 15 years that the opposition parties have been using it in a very successful way. Research has shown that some of the elections were won because of, you know, not because of social media, but because social media existed. So definitely there's an impact on that side. But I think in general, it's just about people having their voice and having the freedoms to speak. So the government obviously have responded back. Yeah, so the government also has their own networks. Barisan Nasional has the Unit Media Baru, which, you know, deals with a lot of this kind of online campaigns and talking points. I think that the danger is that there have been situations where the government has also kind of used existing laws to clamp down on speech online. So we have seen people who have just posted things on Twitter and on Facebook, and some of them, you know, so what is sensitive is subjective, right? So some things that many people don't consider, these people have been brought in to be investigated. So we have in the last year, for example, used the Sedition Act to investigate or arrest people so many times for things that they've said online. So I think that's one of the examples of how it may be personally not the best response from the government, but they have their reasons for doing it, and a reason that maybe many people don't agree with. I think that's the clearest example, other than the fact that they are all obviously responding, and then, you know, there's a lot of conversation these days about the idea of cyber troopers, the practice of astroturfing, and while it's being talked around like almost like a myth, there's not been much studies done, but there has been evidence of the existence of these people. We just don't know kind of how directly linked they are with whichever political parties that are using it as a strategy. Yeah, so I guess when you're talking about digital divide, we're really talking about kind of, I mean, on a more simplistic level, is who has access to technology and who doesn't, and what kind of certain kind of technologies. Malaysia is quite fascinating in the sense that we have quite a high level of internet penetration, right? So we are at Adelaide, like 67, I think, if I'm not mistaken, which is very high. But that's also because our country we have a very low, we got a high literacy level as well, because everybody goes to school, and education is free to a certain level. But what happens is that access to the technology. So while you might be able to afford a handphone, you might not be able to afford data and use it the way that anybody else can. The other thing, I think, so that's one problem, obviously, yeah. So you can really see that some people have access to it, able to kind of use it more for their democratic purposes or whatever they want to use, and then there's another set of people who kind of go, I can only use it to actually make phone calls and do my day-to-day lives. There have been initiatives to try and help bridge that. So for example, and this is not necessarily a good thing, but organizations like Facebook has worked together with local telcos to give access to their site for free, with something like Facebook Zero and things like that. And there's a huge global zero rating movement that's happening. But I think the other thing that we need to also realize is the language barrier. So we kind of, I think what's happening with the political sphere is that there's a lot of discourse happening in the English language among the English-speaking people. If you look at the tweets and updates from a lot of politicians, a lot of them is in English. Yes, they do kind of have a Malay version as well and stuff, but most of the time also the papers kind of report what's being said with the English discourse. Maybe it just happens that the people who speak out, or the activists and that kind of stuff, civil society, also engage in that language. So I think that's also the research is there, but I don't think there's enough kind of research about kind of what's happening with people who speak languages in less urban areas. And then of course there's a whole community of indigenous people who have no access to these things. I mean, they're worrying about feeding themselves, let alone whether they have access to the internet. So I think we've got a huge problem. So I think civil society is catching up. So I think there's two issues. So one is kind of just in trying to get their voices out there and stuff. That one it's done. We've been doing it for 10 years, since the blogging movement and everything and all. And it's been quite relatively successful in that sense. I think that there is greater democracy, there is more pluralism, there is more kind of discourse. The second is, I think we need to kind of, when we think of the technologies as well, is we need to kind of start looking into rights. And obviously we have, so the discourse and everything is fighting for human rights and, fair elections and all that kind of things. But globally, we're also dealing with issues of privacy and surveillance. And the thing is, with these things, it's also secretive, and governments hide behind the notion of protecting you from terrorism and that kind of things, that we don't know what technology our governments have, and we don't know what extent of surveillance is happening to us on a regular basis. So it took a whistleblower like Edward Snowden to leak out what's happening in the US. And like just a few weeks ago, they were talking about how 3 French presidents were being spied on. If you can spy on 3 French presidents, like, what chances do people like us have, right? So I think that's something that we need to start thinking about and start addressing. It's going to be very difficult, because obviously these are all things that are shrouded in secrecy, but I think we need to be ready for it, and we need to kind of, and that's the part I think civil society needs to kind of be a bit more aware of. Things are starting, the conversations are happening. In April, a digital rights conference called RightsCon came out of the US for the first time to Southeast Asia, and it went to Manila, and there were about 20 or 30 of us from Malaysia representing different issues and different kind of courses, talking about the issues that we were dealing with and stuff. And there was a lot of exchange with other people in the region. Obviously some countries are a bit more blatant about their kind of filtering and stuff, so they have more experience with it, whereas in Malaysia we are always kind of we not hide, but we think that we are okay because we've got the Internet Bill of Guarantees, Bill of Rights, that says that the internet will not be censored. At the same time, not many people know that actually we have been censoring websites, even though we've had that Bill of Guarantee. So we think that we are okay, but we don't know the little things that are happening. So I think this is where civil society needs to pay a bit more attention into. And the movement is growing, but obviously not as strong yet, because I think they all see it as one cause, as opposed to this one thing would have an effect on every single right issue that we're dealing with.